My paranormal experiences began in the early 80s and wound up being my last one in 1996. In 1996, I'd just gotten out of the military and I was attending college in Washington State. During this time, I'd taken a job at a local theater. This theater, it's very old. It dated back to the gold rush times. And for anyone who's not familiar, Washington State was a layover for the people headed to Alaska during the gold rush. This theater was used for all sorts of things. First, it started off as a theater. It was a bar at one point. It was a supply store. Then it transitioned back to a theater. In the late 20s, I believe, is when it was shut down, and there was a large gap of time, and then it opened back up in the late 80s. I was working the night shift, cleaning up after the shows. This theater was broken down into three different places. So you would have your main show that was showing, and then you had two side theaters that were showing other features. The gist of the cleanup is basic like any other janitorial job. We go in, we clean up the theater, and as we go out, we make sure that the alarms are set, that there's nothing hanging, so that none of the sensors will go off. I'd probably worked there a month or so before I really started having any type of experiences. And it started off mild. I would close a theater, and then I would be in the lobby or wherever, and I would get an alarm signal. So I would go back and check whichever area it was. And at first I thought, well, I'm just clumsy. I don't know what I'm doing. Let me reset this. So it would happen and it would happen. And finally it just got to where it's like, okay, well, I'll just set it. And if it goes off, hopefully it doesn't go off after I leave. One night when the experience culminated, when it came to the absolute climax of the most paranormal event of my life, I had been there a little longer, maybe a couple of months at this point. I had cleaned up both theaters. I was moving over towards the main theater. It's a much larger theater. I believe it held around 250 people. It wasn't huge, but it wasn't small. So this was all cleaned up, had my alarm set. I was in the lobby, and I was cleaning the popcorn machine, the soda machine, just basic janitorial work. I had a feeling that something was watching me. It just didn't feel right. And I kind of shrugged it off. And then eventually I stood up and I looked. And when you look to your right, if you're standing at the popcorn machine, the theater had the old single type seatings. I would describe it like Ford's Theater with the individual boxes. So the balcony was still there, but they had renovated it so that these seats up top, about 20, 25 seats maybe, they were open so you could sit up there. And it had the nice staircase that went up to the top of the seating. As I turned and looked, as sure as I was holding cleaning material, as tangible as that material in my hand was, I saw a little girl, and she was just sitting on the stairs, and it startled me. She was not transparent. She was wearing a dress. It was just like looking at a person. She wasn't pale. She didn't appear to be anything but a child that somebody had left behind. I would say she was maybe 8, 9 years old at the time. When I turned, it startled me. I'm sure I said, oof, or something. And I said, oh, hey, sweetie, where's your parents? Are you lost or what's going on? And she just kept looking at me. She never said a word to me. So I spoke to her again, and there's nothing. I thought, okay, all right. So I turn around. To get out of the concession area, you have to lift the tabletop and fold it over and go out and around. Well, as I went out, I'd look behind me to see if she was still there, but she was gone. There's only one place she could go. If she would have come down the stairs and went right, she would have gone to the exit, but those were locked. The theater was closed, so those doors were already locked. If she would have gone left, she would have gone back into the main theater, only down on the lower floor. And the third option was to go past me. So she could have only gone upstairs. I thought, well, okay, I've scared her. It feels creepy, but there's nothing to make you think this is something out of the ordinary. So I walk up the stairs, and as I get to the top of the stairs, the staircase rounds around to the left and then back to the right, and it opens up into this seating area. I come and I have my flashlight. I'm calling for her, and she's not answering, and I'm not hearing anything. So I've got my flashlight, and I'm looking all around, and there's nothing. So I thought, well, okay, she's got to be hiding. Now, I have to say that this balcony, if you went over the balcony and looked straight down, it was about a 30-foot drop. So she couldn't have jumped over that. So I went back into the lobby, and I turned on all the lights so that I could see. I went back upstairs. Now, when I talk about turning on all the lights, you could turn on the lights just in that area, and the rest of the theater would be dark. You had your aisle lights, they were always on. So you had a small glow, which made it even worse after everything that happened, because you have that glow that's coming from these aisle lights. So I go back up, and I'm looking, and I'm looking between the seats, and it's not a big area to search, so I was able to do this rather quickly. And I'm like, where is this child? So I'm going to go and look over the balcony. Temperature, you can feel a temperature change. And I would bet that temperature dropped anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees. It dropped enough and fast enough that goosebumps popped up on my arms. As I turned to look over the balcony, I looked down. Now, when I described this theater as being an old theater, it's old. I believe it was built in the 1860s, maybe, somewhere around there. Maybe the 1840s. I can't remember the exact date. So it had this stage down front. It was a wooden stage. It had been refurbished over time, but it had the stage and it had the curtains. The theater screen would retract and go down whenever there was a show playing. So whenever there was no movies playing, the screen was retracted, and you could see the curtains, you could see the stage. It even had, back in the day, they used to use candles for the stage lighting. So it had the boxes where the candles would sit in. Those boxes were still there. I looked down, and this girl is standing on the stage. And I can't express this enough when I say that my blood literally ran cold. She had this pale glow about her face. Her clothing, you could see it, but it wasn't illuminated like her face was. Her face had a glow on it. And I can't give the words for how frightened I was. My heart went into my feet. My stomach was in my throat. And the girl was just standing there, and she was still standing there. But I didn't stay around very long. That fear kicked in pretty quick. And I turned and went back down and around the stairs. As I go down the stairs, the telephone, the main phone to the theater, is hanging on the wall. As I go out, I grab the phone, I dial 911, I lay the phone on the counter, and I go outside and wait for the police. I go across the street. I'm standing on the sidewalk on the other side of the street. It takes maybe 15 minutes for the police to get there. It was long enough that I was thinking, do I need to go back in and call again? This was a time before everyone had a cell phone. I was in college at the time. There were cell phones, but I couldn't afford a cell phone back then. So I thought, do I need to go back in? And they said, my mind said, no, just wait. So maybe about 15 minutes later, the police showed up. When he comes up, I flag him down. I said, hey, I'm over here. When the officers got out of their cars, it was just instant irritation. You could just tell that they were irritated. But at that point, I was thinking, hey, they just don't want to be here. So as I'm starting to explain this to the officer, he pretty abruptly cuts me off and says, this is an ongoing thing with you guys. He said, if you guys don't want to be here, why do you work here? Why do you work at night? And why, this is constant. He said, he tells me, let me guess, there's a girl. And I said, absolutely. I think her parents are lost. And then I related this entire story to him. Well, unbeknownst to me, and it didn't until I talked to my manager the next day, the experience I had is almost mirrors the experience that the other people had. She would disappear. They would go to look for her, and then there she would be on the stage. So the officer said, well, I'm going to go in. You need to stay out here. So they go in, and they're in there a minute. It's a big theater, so I know they went through the entire theater. And there was absolutely nothing. They came out, and they actually gave me a written warning for misusing 911. And these officers would not believe what I had told them. We locked up. I asked them to go back in with me while I locked up. They wouldn't. They said, no, you're good. They left. I had the keys, obviously. And as I said, the protocol was to lock all the theaters and set the individual alarms in each theater. I simply locked the front doors, took my keys, got in my car, drove the 30 minutes home, and called my boss from there. And I told him, hey, your theater's going to be basically unlocked in the morning. The front doors are locked. I'm not sure if I set the alarm. I don't remember. He asked me what happened. As I started to explain it to him, he said, oh, yeah, you've met our little girl. And I said, little girl? He said, absolutely. So around the turn of the century, there was a large fire in the theater, and it was almost gutted. And there was one small child who perished in the fire. And she was about 8 years old. And they actually had a family photo that my boss had back in his office, and he showed me the photo. It was a photo of the parents. It was, the old-timey photos. And apparently this photo had been taken just maybe a week or two before the fire had happened and the little girl died. But she was wearing, it was obviously black and white, but she was wearing exactly the dress that she was wearing in that picture. So that's my paranormal experience for Washington State. My next paranormal experience was when I was much, much younger. I went to live with my grandparents when I was very young, maybe around 4 years old. My biological parents lived in an old house. This house dated from somewhere around the 20s, but it was an old house. It was in the country. Didn't know a lot about the history of the house. My grandparents had bought the house, I believe, after my grandfather had come back from the war. But at that point, my biological parents were living there. A lot of the reasons, I think, like I said, I was very young, but my biological father wasn't necessarily a good guy. He had his moment. And I think that's why my grandparents came and I went to live with them. I don't remember anything bad that happened. My grandparents would come and they would house sit for my parents. They had some out-of-state jobs. They would do other things. And there was reasons that we would have to go to that house. We were there one night and the house just felt different. It was a house, as I said, it was very old, and it just felt different. There was a different air about that house. It just felt like there was always something around you, even when there was nothing around. My grandmother and I, we were watching TV. I guess I was maybe 8, 9 years old at the time. Where I come from, we'd never knocked. We didn't lock our doors. We didn't lock our windows. And if you went to visit someone, you opened your door and you stuck your head in and said, hey, I'm here. My grandmother and I are on the couch and we're watching TV and we hear a knock on the door. Now, this door, the knock that I'm speaking about, this door was a door from I would say probably when the house was built. So around the 20s. This was a thin door with very thin glass. So the wind could blow the wrong way and it would rattle and you could hear the glass in the window rattling. It was a light knock. And my grandmother, she looked and she said, well, come on in. But there was nothing. So a few minutes went by. We went back to watching TV. and another small knock. She says, "Come in." There's nothing. So my grandmother walks to the door and she opens it. Now this door, the glass that was up top of the door, it had sort of a lace curtain, that white lace with the holes through it that had the different designs and whatnot. It was dark, so you couldn't see outside. We didn't have yard lights or anything like that. And this was in the country. And my grandmother goes and she opens the door and there's no one there. And she sticks her head out and she looks left and she looks right and there's nothing. So she just, I guess in her mind, she blows it off. She comes back and sits on the couch and we're watching TV again. And again, there was the knock on the door. And this time, my grandmother, she wasn't a person to get agitated, but she got very agitated over things that she thought were silly. So knocking on a door or knocking on a door and running away, things like this, I think they call it ghost knocking or something. That would be something that would irritate her immensely. So she came up and she goes and she opens and she's talking the entire time to the door. And she opens the door. I mean, she pulls the door open hard and she steps completely out and she's looking. And she says, "Who is out here?" And there's nothing. And she's probably there a good few minutes. And then she comes back. I don't know what had happened. We again started watching TV. I guess maybe she heard something. I don't know. But she just says, I hear her say, "Don't knock again." About that time, the door was like it was going to come off of its hinges. It shook so violently that we did not know if that window was going to break. The door was just violently shaking. My grandmother runs over. She opens the door. And the thing that was so scary for me is that this door was shaking right to the moment that she got there. And when she grabbed the door handle and opened it, the door stopped shaking. And there's no possible way that anyone could have shaken that door the way they were shaking it and gotten away before she opened that door. She closes the door. She turns the TV off and she says, "Come with me. We're going." So we went through the house and out the other door, got in her car, and we left. I remember her telling my biological mother, "Don't ask me to house sit for you again. I don't want to go there." It was later after this experience. It could have been maybe a year. Like I said, I said the first part about my father and the problems he seemed to have. My father, as I got older, I would go and I would visit him. I would talk to him. I didn't have anything against him. And when we were at the house, this man was a different person. He was just mean. He was junkyard mean. You would see him outside. He would come to my grandparents and he seemed just like a completely different person. I visited him at work later on when I was older. And he seemed like a different person. We would go fishing. He was all right. So for the longest time, I was just absolutely confused. We had gone again to the house. My biological father was there and he was asleep on the couch. He starts tossing and turning. And my grandmother is hitting him on the foot. I don't know where my biological mother was, but I know she wasn't there. It was my grandmother, her son, and myself. So she's shaking him on the foot. And he's mumbling. He's very animated. He's very excited, but he's asleep. As I got older, I'm raised Catholic. My grandmother's Catholic. As I got older, as my confirmation came around, I started to learn Latin. So I know enough Latin that I can attend Latin Mass. I'm not fluent, but I do know a bit. I look back on it and I know, knowing what I know today, that this man was speaking Latin. The thing is that while he was speaking, he sat completely up. He was lying on the couch, his head on the armrest with his legs obviously stretched out across the couch. This man sat straight up No arms, no legs, just straight up. Anyone who's ever laid on a 3-cushion couch, I think, can appreciate how hard it is, or how hard it would be to sit straight up like that. But he did. And when he sat up, his eyes opened and they were rolled all the way to the back of his head, and it was nothing but the whites of his eyes. My grandmother grabbed me, and he was, again, it was more like a chant that it wasn't speaking. It was more like he was chanting. My grandmother grabbed me. We went out the same door we went out the first time. As we were getting into the car, my father comes running out. He was telling Mom, where are you going? What's going on? And she said, you need to get away from me. Go back in the house. We're leaving. Like I said, I was very young, so I was sheltered from a lot of the conversations that happened. I don't know what happened. I don't know the conversations that happened after that, but I do know that my father began to attend church a lot more than he did previous to that. I don't know if things got better. It never seemed to get better. I only had a few more years left before I eventually went out on my own. My last paranormal experience happened a few years before my grandfather passed away. Again, I was young, but I was young enough to get around. My cousin lived in the city away from us, about 30 miles or so. And he would come and stay the weekends or a week or a month, whatever the season was. His father did not want to drive him all the way to my grandmother's, so I would drive on the 3-wheeler to my parents' house. This is where they were going to drop him off. This was maybe 6 miles from my grandmother, so it was a little bit of a drive. And anyone who doesn't know what a 3-wheeler is, just imagine a 4-wheeler, a farm 4-wheeler with only one wheel up front and handlebars. So I drove up to meet my cousin. I was fully expecting him to be there when I arrived, but when I got there, he wasn't. There was no one there. So I went into the house, and I was in the kitchen. I was making something to eat. As a matter of fact, I remember very clearly what I was making. This was back in the days well before microwaves. If you wanted popcorn, you had to work for it. There was a product called Jiffy Popcorn. I'm pretty sure that's the name of it, but it came in a tinfoil pan with a tinfoil lid over it. You simply peeled the paper off the top, you set it on the fire, and the tinfoil it was a thin tinfoil, so it would bubble, and the popcorn would bubble, and it would make this big bubble. You just rip the tinfoil open, and you got your popcorn. I was making this popcorn, and as I said, I got there and I knew no one was there, even though I was expecting them to be there. As I'm making this popcorn, I hear my name, and it sounds exactly like him. And I said, just a minute, give me a few minutes. He said, okay. I turned the popcorn and finished. I turned the fire off and I set it to the side. Now, the house that my biological parents lived in, here where I'm from, we tend to just make houses. We will, it's not so much that way now, but back in those days, somebody might buy a trailer house for $100. They might buy another one, and then they might buy another one, and those things would all just be piecemeal together. My biological father had done basically this. He lived in the old house that I was speaking of earlier. The back of this house faced north, front was south, east and west. He had bought a trailer, and he had placed it onto the north side of the house. It ran east to west, but it was on the north side of the house. The longer portion of the house was facing east. On the west side of the house, he had done the same thing with a different trailer, except this trailer ran north to south along the house, with the majority of the trailer pointing south. So I remember as a kid, it was like a maze. It was really like a maze. You could get lost in there. And that's just how things were, I suppose, back then, at least for me. So the kitchen, anyone who's familiar with a trailer house, the kitchen is at one end. or close to the middle. This kitchen was at the very end of the trailer house, and it would have been on the east side. So this is where I'm making this popcorn, and this is where I hear the voice. After I'm finished, I turn, and you can see all the way down the hallway to the end of the trailer where there's a bedroom and a door is closed. And as you walk down, you walk from the kitchen into a living room. Then you walk out of the living room into a hallway. There's a laundry room on your right, a bathroom on your right, and just across from the bathroom would be a door, and then a bedroom at the end. As I walk down the hallway, I'm looking in each room, and there's no one. So I open the back door, which is what's connected to the main house. So you can open this door. There's a small walkway, and it's an enclosed walkway, and it goes into the next house. So I'm calling for my cousin this entire time with no answer. I walk down, and I open the door to go into the next part of the house. So I'm already on edge, because this is when I'm older, and I had my previous experiences when I was much younger. So I was rather nervous being there by myself, but I have to wait for him. So I think that I'm hearing him. I can hear a voice. He said, "Hey, I'm in here." As you walk into the main house, there's another living room type area, and then you walk through that, and there's a bedroom. You walk into that bedroom, and it goes into another bedroom. So it's just, I don't know if you're familiar with a house from the 20s, but it's just very basic, very simple design, not a lot of exits. You had to pretty much go through one room to get to another. I check all of these rooms. There's only 4 to include a bath, and he's not there. So I go out the side, and as I'm checking, it would repeat. As I would finish a room and no one's here, I would hear, "No, I'm over here." I go to the next part of the house, which is the same thing. You open a door, you go into the trailer. It's a different type of layout. This trailer, the kitchen, was more towards the center with 2 bedrooms on each end and a bathroom in the hallway. At this time, I'm really starting to be nervous, and it's really not sitting well with me. I walk into the trailer, and I look, and I don't see anything. And I believe I said, "Look, I'm tired of this. I'm going outside." And then I hear, "No, I'm back here." But this is coming from behind me, from the house that I had just gone to. So there would be 2 ways to get back there. He would have to come back the way I was, or he would have to go out the door and around and come back through. So I was going to go out that door that I thought maybe he had gone through and came back around. But when I got there, there's a deadbolt. Well, it's not a deadbolt. It's just a small latch that can only be latched from the inside. That latch was engaged. It was in place. It was latched, meaning that he could not have gone out that door and then locked the latch back. So at this point, I'm very nervous, and I'm scared. So I pick up my pace a little bit, and I go out this second trailer into the main house, and then onto the porch I was speaking of that connects the other house. There's a door going out, and I'm going to go out that door. And it was cracked just a little bit. And what was even more, I will say, sinister about this is I know that door wasn't cracked when I went through it. I would have, because I really believe if it was cracked, I would have gone that way thinking that's the way he went. But it wasn't. It wasn't cracked. But when I came back through this time, it was. So I thought, okay, maybe he's messing with me. Maybe he did come back through, because every time he would say, "No, I'm here," it sounded exactly like his voice. I'm going to go out the door. And as I go to open that door, it's like a draft caught it. And it was maybe cracked 2 or 3 inches, but it slammed hard. I don't know. The only way a door could slam only being cracked that far is if you ran up and kicked it or slammed into it or something. But it wasn't that. No one slammed into it. I didn't slam into it. So the door slammed shut. And of course, I immediately grabbed the handle, and I'm trying to open it. The handle won't turn. The door will not open. And the house just filled with this maniacal laughter. This was not an evil laugh. I guess maybe you could say it had a hint of evil to it, but this was not an evil laugh It was maniacal. It was, I've got you. I've scared you. I've accomplished whatever mission it is that I'm on. Whatever this was just laughing, but I know it wasn't human. I cannot describe how this laughter just filled the entire house. You could feel it in your chest. You could feel it in your legs. I just crumbled. The door, if you're facing the door, about 3 feet to your right, my parents had a deep freezer there, and it was a little shorter than me. I think this deep freeze, it might have been 3.5 foot tall, and it was very long. And I just crumbled right there with my back against the wall. I had my knees to my chest and my face buried in my knees. And I know I was screaming. I had my hands on my ears and I was screaming, and all I could hear was this laughter. I did not hear the door open. I did not hear anyone say anything, but all of a sudden, my grandfather grabs me, and I know I yelled. I screamed and screamed and screamed because I didn't realize at first it was him, but he's got me by both shoulders and he's holding me up and he's shaking me and he's saying, "What is wrong?" And I just grabbed him and he set me down, and I just grabbed a hold of his legs around his waist and I wouldn't let go. And so he picks me up by my belt loop and the collar of my shirt again, and he puts me into the truck, and I'm trying to tell him that someone's in the house. He goes into the door that he came in where I was sitting. I don't know where he went. I don't know if he went left. I don't know if he went right. I don't know which part he went in first, but he was gone. I don't know how long. I don't know how long, but he was gone a minute. He came out a different door. If you're sitting in the driveway and you're looking at the house, this first trailer I spoke of that ran east to west and then into the house, it created sort of a courtyard in an L shape right there. So there was grass and whatnot there. And so you could go into the trailer on one door. You could go into the trailer where my grandfather had pulled me out. He went in. He was in for however long. And then he came back out the opposite door into this courtyard. He didn't say a word, but I could tell that he was somewhat flustered. My grandfather was an infantryman. He went to World War II. He fought in North Africa. I believe he left Germany in 1944. The war was still going on when he left, but he was there for years. Back in those days, anyone who's familiar with the Army or the military, we do rotations. We go for a few months and then we come back, or a year, or whatever it is we're doing, then we come back. In those days, when you went in the Army, you went until the war was won, and then you came home. Well, he came home a little before in 1944, and my grandfather was a very stoic man. He had very few emotions. He had very few facial expressions. He was just a thinker and doer. He thought about it, and then he did it. He thought it, he planned it, he did it. You did not get a lot of emotions out of him. So when there was even the slightest bit of emotions with him, you could see it. And when he came out, I could tell very well that something had happened. He came out, he opened the car door, or the pickup, he gets in the truck, and he says, "Well, boy, I don't want you back up here by yourself anymore." I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Nothing, but your cousin's not here. Let's go." And I said, "Well, what about my 3-wheeler?" He said, "We can always get that later." We left. We went home. He called my cousin's father, who had not even left his house. So he was running behind. So he's still at home. And I guess they told him, bring him down to the house. But that is the last time I was ever in that house by myself up until I turned 18 years old, joined the military, and left. I was never in that house alone again. And I believe the house burned down. I think it was the late 90s. It was just they don't know what burned it down. The house was solid. Yes, it was built to hillbilly specifications, but the house was solid. It did not leak. It didn't rock. The house was solid. It had good electric in it, good wiring. and the fire department ruled it undetermined. So the house just burned. They built a new house later on. I've been there a few times, and it's a completely different feeling. I don't know if there was something attached to the house itself. I don't know if it was attached to the land, but I do know that something was there, and whatever that something is gone now. And that is my paranormal experiences.
If you've had a paranormal experience and would like to be a guest on the show, please contact us by going to myparax.com. That's myparaex.com. Thanks for listening.